The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and lavender. Dren had always loved this time of day. The lake, his secret haven, was far from the city's chaos, a place where time seemed to stand still. Tonight, the surface of the water was perfectly still, a flawless mirror reflecting the fading light. He leaned against the rough bark of a weathered oak tree, his thermos of tea warm in his hands. The calm of the evening wrapped around him like a comforting blanket, and he felt the stress of the day melt away. But then, something broke the stillness. At first, it was just a glimmer, a strange light flickering across the lake's surface. Dren squinted, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't the moon's reflection. This was alive, shifting, and pulsating like a heartbeat. He stood, his curiosity piqued. As he stepped closer to the shore, the light moved, growing brighter. And then, from the shadows of the nearby woods, she appeared. Dren's breath caught in his throat. She wasn't human. That much was immediately clear. Her skin shimmered faintly, a soft iridescent glow that seemed to ripple like waves under her smooth surface. Her eyes were large, almond-shaped, and mesmerizing, shifting in a kaleidoscope of colors that seemed to tell a story all their own. Her hair flowed in strands of silver and pale lavender, moving as if stirred by an invisible breeze. He froze, his mind racing between awe and fear. She looked delicate, graceful, almost angelic, but the sheer otherworldliness of her presence left him rooted to the spot. The alien woman noticed him instantly. She tilted her head, her expression curious rather than hostile. Slowly, she took a step forward, her bare feet making no sound on the mossy ground. Dren finally found his voice. Who are you?" She didn't answer in words, not as he understood them. Instead, she emitted a soft, melodic sound, like a blend of whispers and wind chimes. The sound was soothing, calming his initial apprehension. She pointed toward the lake, then at herself, then mimed a motion of diving. "You want to swim?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. She smiled, a small, gentle curve of her lips, and nodded. Dren blinked. Was he dreaming? Sure. Go ahead." He gestured toward the water, feeling ridiculous. She didn't need his permission, but she seemed to appreciate the gesture. What he didn't expect was for her to extend a hand toward him, her expression bright with invitation. "Me?" Dren pointed at himself, baffled. "No, I'm not dressed for." She laughed, the sound light and musical, and without waiting for his reply, she sprinted toward the lake. Her movements were so fluid they seemed almost unreal, and when she dove into the water, she left barely a ripple. What happened next left him speechless. The lake came alive. Wherever she moved, the water lit up in radiant colors, vivid blues, greens, and purples that shimmered and danced like living light. She swam with a grace that made the water her canvas, painting it with her presence. Dren couldn't help but smile. "All right, you win," he muttered. He set his thermos aside, kicked off his shoes, and waded in. The moment his feet touched the water, a warmth spread through him, and the glowing trails began to follow his movements too. It was less vibrant than hers, but it still felt magical. She swam toward him, her eyes glimmering with joy. Up close, he noticed intricate, glowing patterns etched across her arms and neck, like constellations in a night sky. "This is incredible," he said, his voice filled with wonder. She giggled, her laughter sparkling in the air, and splashed him playfully. Before he could react, she darted away, her body moving like a ribbon through the water. Dren gave chase, laughing despite himself. They swam together, their movements weaving a tapestry of light across the lake. He was clumsy compared to her elegance, but she didn't seem to mind. Her smiles and playful gestures encouraged him, and for a while, he forgot his initial fear. As the stars began to dot the sky, Dren paused to catch his breath. She floated nearby, her gaze fixed on him. "Why are you here?" he asked softly. Her expression shifted to something deeper, almost wistful. Slowly, she swam closer and reached out, placing her hand over his chest. Her touch was warm, almost electric, and he felt something, an unspoken message that resonated within him. "I came for this," her eyes seemed to say, and in that moment, he understood. They were from different worlds, but somehow they had found each other. The lake had grown darker, its glowing surface now illuminated only by her presence and the faint echoes of their playful swim. Dren sat at the edge of the water, the wet grass cool beneath him, as he watched her float effortlessly near the center of the lake. She was mesmerizing, but not just because of her beauty. There was something about her, something unspoken yet profoundly magnetic. Every movement she made, every glance she cast his way, carried a sense of wonder that left him spellbound. "You're not just passing through, are you?" Dren murmured aloud, more to himself than to her. The alien woman tilted her head, her eyes catching his in the dim light. She swam closer, the glowing patterns on her skin pulsating gently as if responding to his words. When she reached the shore, she emerged from the water with the same effortless grace, droplets shimmering like tiny stars as they rolled off her skin. Dren stood, suddenly self-conscious. She approached him, her bare feet silent on the damp earth, and stopped just inches away. "You can't talk, can you?" he asked softly. She smiled faintly and raised her hand again, this time brushing her fingertips lightly against his temple. The sensation was startling, like a ripple of warmth spreading through his mind. Images flashed behind his eyes, fleeting but vivid. He saw stars, countless and endless, their light brighter than anything he'd ever seen. He saw a vast, crystalline structure hovering in a sky of shifting colors. And then he saw her, standing alone in an empty expanse, looking toward a distant, glowing sphere. Earth. Dren stumbled back, clutching his head. You came here? From out there?" She nodded slowly, her expression softening. "But why? Why come all this way?" Instead of answering, she reached down, plucking a small flower growing near the lake's edge. She held it up between them, her delicate fingers cradling it as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Then she pointed to him and placed the flower against her chest, right over her heart. Dren stared at her, the meaning of the gesture sinking in. "You came, for us? For people like me?" She smiled, her luminous eyes holding his with a warmth that made his chest tighten. "Why me?" he whispered. This time, she didn't answer with gestures. She stepped closer, her presence radiating a gentle heat, and placed her hand on his chest again, just over his heart. Her touch was featherlight, yet it sent a jolt through him, a sensation both foreign and exhilarating. He could feel it now, the faint hum of her connection. It wasn't just her touch, it was her energy, her essence, reaching out to his. Dren's heart pounded. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. "I don't understand any of this," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "But I want to." Her smile widened, and she stepped back, her luminous form shimmering like a mirage. Then, to his surprise, she beckoned him to follow. "Wait, where are we going?" Dren asked, but she was already moving, her figure a soft glow against the shadows of the trees. He hesitated only for a moment before following her into the forest. The woods were alive with the soft hum of night, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, but everything else felt strangely muted. Dren's eyes adjusted to the darkness as he followed her glowing form deeper into the trees. After a while, they reached a small clearing bathed in moonlight. In the center was a large, flat stone, its surface covered in faintly glowing patterns that mirrored the markings on her skin. "What is this place?" Dren asked, his voice hushed. She turned to him, her eyes bright with an intensity that made his breath catch. Without hesitation, she stepped onto the stone, her bare feet causing the patterns to glow more brightly. Then she looked at him and extended her hand. "You want me to stand there with you?" he guessed. She nodded, her expression encouraging. Dren hesitated. Something about this felt monumental, as if crossing this threshold would change everything. But her gaze was steady, her outstretched hand unwavering, and he couldn't bring himself to say no. He stepped onto the stone, her hand warm and steady in his. The moment he joined her, the stone came alive. Light surged from its surface, spiraling upward in shimmering threads that surrounded them. The patterns on her skin began to pulse in rhythm with the light, and Dren realized, with a mix of awe and trepidation, that his body was starting to glow as well. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the hum of energy around them. She stepped closer, her free hand brushing against his cheek. Her touch was tender, and in her eyes, he saw reassurance. The light grew brighter, enveloping them completely. Dren felt a warmth spread through him, not just on his skin but deep within, as though his very being was being touched by something infinite. And then he saw it. Memories, not his but hers, flooded his mind. He saw her world, vibrant and beautiful yet tinged with loneliness. He saw her people, their faces etched with longing as they gazed toward the stars. And he saw her journey, a solitary voyage across the galaxy in search of something they had all dreamed of, connection. Tears welled in Dren's eyes. "You've been searching for us?" She nodded, her hand still resting against his cheek. "Why me?" he asked again, his voice breaking. Her answer came not in words but in a feeling, a surge of warmth and affection that filled him completely. It was as if she were telling him that he, in this moment, was enough. For the first time, Dren understood. The world around them seemed to stand still as the light faded, leaving only the soft glow of the moon and the faint shimmer of the markings on her skin. Dren stood on the stone, his pulse racing, his thoughts a tangled mess of wonder, disbelief, and something deeper he couldn't quite name. The alien woman, this radiant being from another world, watched him with a patience that both calmed and unsettled him. Her eyes, ever changing in their colors, reflected not just the stars but something more intimate. "Why me?" Dren asked again, his voice soft, almost afraid of the answer. She stepped closer, her movements unhurried, and placed her hand on his chest once more. This time, he didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned into the warmth of her touch, drawn to the connection he could feel but not fully understand. As her hand rested over his heart, Dren felt something stir within him, a pulse of emotion, raw and unfiltered. It wasn't just hers, it was his own feelings being mirrored back at him, amplified by her presence. "You feel what I feel," he realized, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her lips curving into a gentle smile. "What does this mean?" he asked. She tilted her head thoughtfully, then knelt on the stone and began tracing patterns in the glowing surface with her fingertips. The symbols she drew were intricate, almost hypnotic, and though Dren couldn't decipher them, he felt their meaning resonate deep within him. "You're showing me something, aren't you?" he said, kneeling beside her. She glanced at him, her expression softening, and nodded. Then, to his surprise, she took his hand and guided it to the stone. The moment his fingers touched the surface, a jolt of energy coursed through him. Images flooded his mind, fragmented but vivid. He saw her alone in a shimmering vessel, navigating through endless darkness. He felt her loneliness, her longing, and the unyielding hope that had driven her across the stars. And then, he saw himself. The vision wasn't of the present but of the past. Memories of quiet evenings by the lake, his moments of solitude, the ache of a heart that had grown accustomed to being alone. "You saw me," he whispered, his throat tight. "You were watching me." She didn't look away. Instead, she placed her hand on his cheek, her eyes glistening with something unmistakable. "Why?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why would you come all this way? What made you choose me?" Her answer wasn't in words. She leaned closer, her touch gentle, and rested her forehead against his. The gesture was intimate, almost sacred, and in that moment, Dren felt her emotions as clearly as if they were his own. "You are the one who understands." The thought wasn't spoken, yet it echoed in his mind with crystal clarity. He gasped, pulling back slightly, though her hand remained on his face, grounding him. "I'm just a person," he said, struggling to make sense of it all. "I'm not special. I'm not enough for something like this." Her expression turned tender, her gaze unwavering. She leaned in again, and this time, her lips brushed against his, light as a whisper, yet charged with an energy that made his heart stutter. Dren froze, his mind blank except for the sensation of her kiss. It wasn't like anything he'd experienced before. There was no urgency, no demand, only a deep, unspoken promise. When she pulled back, her eyes searched his face, her expression a mixture of hope and vulnerability. Dren exhaled shakily, his thoughts finally finding words. "I don't know what this is. I don't even know if I can be what you're looking for. But I want to try." Her smile widened, and for the first time, he felt the tension in her body ease. She reached for his hand again, intertwining her fingers with his. The glow from her skin pulsed gently, matching the rhythm of his heartbeat. They sat on the stone for what felt like hours, their silence filled with a quiet understanding. Dren couldn't take his eyes off her, this being who had crossed galaxies, braving the unknown, just to find someone who could understand her. "You don't have a name, do you?" he asked after a while. She tilted her head, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. I mean, I can't keep calling you. Well, nothing. He thought for a moment. What about Lumi? Her expression brightened, and she repeated the name, not with words but with a soft melodic hum that sent shivers down his spine. I'll take that as a yes, he said, grinning despite himself. Lumi leaned against him, her presence warm and grounding. Dren felt his chest tighten again, though this time it wasn't from confusion or fear. It was the realization that, for the first time in years, he wasn't alone. As the first rays of dawn began to break through the trees, Lumi stood and extended her hand to him once more. "Another adventure?" he asked, standing and taking her hand. She nodded, her smile playful, and led him back toward the lake. Dren followed without hesitation, his heart pounding with anticipation. Whatever this journey was, whatever challenges or mysteries lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. He would face them together, with Lumi by his side. And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly alive. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting golden light over the lake and forest. Dren followed Lumi as she walked along the shoreline, her feet barely disturbing the soft grass. The glow of her skin was now faint in the sunlight, but her presence remained otherworldly. He still couldn't quite believe what had happened in the past few hours. Meeting an alien, one so kind, so alive, and feeling the connection between them wasn't something he'd ever imagined. And yet, as he looked at her, he couldn't deny the bond forming between them. Lumi suddenly stopped and turned to him, her expression serious. She gestured toward the sky, then to the lake, and finally to herself. "You're leaving?" Dren asked, his heart sinking at the thought. She shook her head and touched his arm, her fingers trailing down to his hand. Then she motioned for him to sit by the water. He complied, confused but willing to trust her. Lumi crouched beside him, placing her hands on the ground. The air seemed to hum faintly, and then the water began to ripple, even though there was no wind. The ripples expanded, forming shapes, images that shimmered on the surface like a living painting. Dren leaned closer, his breath catching as the images came into focus. The first scene showed a vast city made of glowing towers that spiraled toward a violet sky. Strange beings, luminous and elegant like Lumi, moved through the streets, their expressions marked by joy and wonder. But as the image shifted, the light in the city dimmed, and the beings' faces turned somber. The colors of the sky faded, replaced by ominous shadows. "What happened?" Dren whispered, his voice heavy with concern. Lumi looked at him, her expression sorrowful. She pointed to the shadows and then to herself, her shoulders drooping as if carrying the weight of an entire world. "Your home. It's in trouble," he said, understanding dawning. "Is that why you're here? To find help?" She nodded slowly, then pointed to him. Dren's chest tightened. "Me? What could I possibly do? I'm just a guy." Lumi touched his hand, her gaze steady and full of determination. She gestured again, this time pointing to the lake, then to the glowing markings on her skin, and finally back to him. "You think I can help because of whatever this connection is between us?" Her expression softened, and she nodded. Dren ran a hand through his hair, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "I don't know, Lumi. I'm not a hero. I don't even know where to start." Lumi cupped his face with both hands, her touch warm and reassuring. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his, just as she had before. In that instant, Dren felt a surge of emotion, not just hers, but his own fears and doubts melting away in the light of her unwavering trust. "All right," he said softly. "I'll try. I don't know how, but I'll try." The morning passed in a blur as Lumi guided Dren through the forest, her steps purposeful and swift. She seemed to know exactly where she was going, though Dren had no idea how. Eventually, they reached a clearing where a strange structure stood. It was sleek and organic, its surface shimmering like liquid metal. The design was unlike anything Dren had ever seen, yet it radiated a sense of belonging, as if it were meant to be here. This is your ship?" he asked, marveling at the sight. Lumi nodded, her smile tinged with relief. She stepped forward, the ship's surface rippling as she placed her hand on it. A section of the hull opened silently, revealing an interior bathed in soft, golden light. Dren hesitated at the threshold, his heart pounding. The idea of leaving Earth, even for a moment, was overwhelming. But Lumi turned to him, her hand outstretched, and the look in her eyes dissolved his fears. "Okay," he said, taking her hand. "Let's do this." Inside, the ship was breathtaking. The walls glowed softly, pulsing like a living heartbeat. Strange, flowing symbols decorated the surfaces, their meanings elusive but comforting. Lumi led Dren to the center of the room, where a circular platform stood. She gestured for him to step onto it, her expression gentle but firm. "What's this for?" he asked nervously. Lumi tilted her head, her eyes scanning him as if searching for the right way to explain. She placed a hand on the platform, and an image appeared above it, a glowing sphere that seemed to pulse with life. Dren stared at the image, trying to make sense of it. "Is that Earth?" She nodded, then pointed to him and back to the sphere. "I'm connected to it?" "How?" Lumi stepped onto the platform beside him and placed her hand over his heart. Her other hand hovered over the glowing sphere, and as she did, a strange warmth spread through Dren. The sphere began to change, its light brightening and shifting in color. He gasped as he felt something deep inside him stir, an energy he hadn't known existed. It wasn't just his own life force, it was the pulse of the earth itself, resonating within him. Lumi's eyes locked onto his, her expression filled with both hope and urgency. She gestured toward the sphere, then to herself, and finally to him. "You're saying, we can do this together? Save your home." Her smile returned, radiant and full of gratitude. Dren nodded, his resolve solidifying. "Then let's get started." As the ship hummed to life around them, Dren felt a strange calm wash over him. The fear and doubt that had plagued him earlier were gone, replaced by a quiet determination. He didn't know what lay ahead or what challenges they would face, but one thing was clear: Lumi had chosen him, not because of what he was, but because of who he was. And for the first time in his life, Dren felt like he belonged, like he had a purpose. As the ship lifted off, the world outside blurred into a kaleidoscope of light. Lumi stood beside him, her hand clasped tightly in his, and together they faced the unknown. The ship moved through the void of space with an elegance that defied Dren's understanding. The walls pulsed gently, as though alive, and the stars outside the transparent panels stretched into streaks of light. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. Dren sat in what appeared to be a command seat, though its soft, organic surface felt more like sitting in a cloud than a chair. Lumi stood nearby, her glowing patterns shifting rhythmically as she interacted with the ship, her hands moving in fluid gestures across an invisible interface. "So, we're really doing this," Dren said, his voice breaking the silence. Lumi glanced back at him, her expression warm and encouraging. She walked over, placing a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. "You've done this before, haven't you?" he asked, looking at her. "Traveling like this, I mean." She nodded but lowered her gaze, a hint of sadness crossing her features. "Alone." Her nod was slower this time, and Dren's heart ached for her. He couldn't imagine the kind of isolation she must have endured, drifting through the cosmos in search of, well, him. "Well, you're not alone anymore," he said firmly. Her eyes met his, gratitude shining in their depths. She placed her hand over his heart, the now familiar warmth of her connection flowing between them. As hours, or maybe days, passed, Lumi guided him through the intricacies of the ship. Though she couldn't speak, her gestures and the flashes of imagery she shared made her intentions clear. Dren learned that the glowing symbols etched across the walls weren't just decoration. They were part of the ship itself, alive and responsive. He marveled as Lumi showed him how to influence the ship's movements by simply touching the walls and focusing his thoughts. "Wait, you mean I can fly this thing with my mind?" he asked incredulously. Lumi smiled and nodded, motioning for him to try. Hesitant but eager, Dren placed his hands on the wall, mimicking Lumi's earlier gestures. The ship seemed to hum in response, and he felt a strange sensation, as though the vessel was an extension of his own body. "Okay, let's see," he murmured, picturing a gentle turn. The ship responded instantly, banking to the left with a smooth grace that left him breathless. "Unbelievable," he said, laughing. It's like magic." Lumi clapped her hands softly, her smile lighting up the room. Later, as they drifted through the endless expanse of stars, Lumi brought Dren to a room at the heart of the ship. Unlike the other spaces, this one was dimly lit, its walls covered in intricate patterns that glowed faintly. In the center of the room stood a crystalline structure, pulsing softly with light. Lumi gestured for Dren to approach. "What is it?" he asked, stepping closer. Lumi placed her hand on the crystal, and a wave of energy radiated through the room. Suddenly, the space filled with projections, images of her homeworld, her people, and the shadows that had begun to consume them. Dren's breath hitched as he saw entire cities collapsing under a dark, creeping force that seemed to devour everything in its path. The despair on the faces of her people was palpable, even through the projections. This is what we're up against?" he asked, his voice heavy. Lumi nodded, her expression somber. Dren clenched his fists, the weight of the task ahead pressing down on him. "How do we stop it?" She turned to him, her gaze steady, and pointed to the crystal. Then she gestured to herself and finally to him, placing her hand over his heart once again. "You're saying the connection between us, it's the key?" Her nod was slow but certain. Dren exhaled deeply, trying to process it all. He wasn't a fighter, a scientist, or a leader. But Lumi believed in him, in the bond they shared, and that belief was enough to spark a glimmer of hope within him. "Okay," he said, meeting her gaze. "We'll figure this out. Together." Their journey brought them to the edge of a star system unlike anything Dren had ever seen. The central star burned a deep purple, casting an eerie glow over the planets that orbited it. As the ship approached the third planet, Lumi's demeanor shifted. She became more focused, her movements quick and precise. "Is this it?" Dren asked, staring out at the world below. She nodded, her glowing patterns brightening with what he could only interpret as urgency. The ship descended through layers of shimmering clouds, revealing a landscape of crystalline forests and rivers that sparkled like liquid light. It was breathtaking, but the beauty was marred by the presence of the creeping shadows Dren had seen in the projections. "Whatever that thing is, it's spreading fast," he said grimly. Lumi placed a hand on his arm, her touch firm yet reassuring. She motioned for him to follow her as the ship landed in a clearing. Outside, the air was crisp and filled with faint melodic hums that seemed to emanate from the very ground. Lumi led Dren through the crystalline forest, her movements swift but deliberate. They eventually reached a large structure, part temple, part fortress, that pulsed with the same light as Lumi's markings. "This is where we make our stand, isn't it?" Dren asked. Lumi turned to him, her expression serious but filled with an unshakable determination. She took both his hands in hers, the warmth of her connection filling him once more. For the first time since this journey began, Dren felt ready. "Let's do this," he said, his voice steady. Lumi smiled, and together, they stepped into the heart of the temple, ready to face whatever awaited them. The heart of the temple was unlike anything Dren could have imagined. Towering crystal pillars pulsed with vibrant energy, their light casting shimmering rainbows across the chamber. The air was alive with a low hum, resonating deep in his chest. At the center of it all was a vast, floating sphere of darkness, a writhing mass of shadow that seemed to devour the light around it. Lumi stood beside him, her glowing patterns flaring brighter than ever. She stepped forward, her expression fierce, and raised her hands toward the darkness. The energy in the room surged in response, the crystals intensifying their light. Dren watched, awestruck, as Lumi's form seemed to merge with the temple's energy. She turned to him, her gaze unwavering, and gestured for him to join her. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice shaking with equal parts fear and determination. She pointed to his chest, then to her own, and finally to the sphere of darkness. "Our connection," he guessed, stepping closer. Lumi nodded, her eyes filled with trust. As Dren placed his hands on one of the glowing pillars, a jolt of energy coursed through him. The warmth of Lumi's connection flooded his senses, stronger than ever before. He felt her emotions, her courage, her love for her people, and her hope that together they could stop the encroaching darkness. But it wasn't just her feelings he felt. His own emotions surged forward, his longing for connection, his newfound purpose, and the growing bond he shared with Lumi. The darkness writhed violently, as if sensing their defiance. Tendrils of shadow lashed out, striking the walls of the chamber and dimming the light of the crystals. "We have to stop it now," Dren shouted, gripping the pillar tighter. Lumi stepped closer to him, her hand reaching for his. When their fingers intertwined, the glow of her markings spread to him, encasing them both in a cocoon of light. The chamber trembled as the light from the crystals channeled through Dren and Lumi. The shadows recoiled, but the sphere of darkness remained, its core pulsing with malevolent energy. Dren closed his eyes, focusing on the connection he shared with Lumi. He felt her presence beside him, steady and unyielding. Her warmth gave him strength, and together they pushed their energy toward the darkness. The light around them grew brighter, each pulse stronger than the last. "It's working!" Dren yelled, his voice filled with hope. But the darkness fought back, sending waves of cold, despairing energy that threatened to overwhelm them. Dren's knees buckled, and he felt himself faltering. "I can't," he began, but Lumi's hand tightened around his. Her eyes met his, and in that moment, she projected an image into his mind, a memory of their first meeting by the lake, the trust they had built, and the love that had grown between them. "You believe in me," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. She nodded, her expression filled with determination. Dren took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Then I won't let you down." With renewed strength, Dren focused everything he had into the connection. He let go of his fear, his doubt, and even his sense of self, pouring all of his energy into the light they shared. The light surged, blinding and pure, engulfing the chamber. The tendrils of shadow dissolved, and the sphere of darkness began to shrink, its writhing form unraveling under the force of their combined will. Finally, with a deafening crack, the sphere imploded, sending a shockwave of light and sound through the room. Dren collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. Lumi knelt beside him, her glowing hands hovering over his chest. Warmth spread through him, soothing his exhaustion. "We did it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Lumi smiled, her expression soft but radiant. She placed her hand over his heart, and he felt a gentle pulse, a reminder of the connection that had saved them both. As they emerged from the temple, the world around them was transformed. The crystalline forest shimmered with vibrant colors, and the once ominous skies were now filled with light. Dren looked at Lumi, who stood beside him, her markings glowing softly in the sunlight. "Your people, will they be okay now?" She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "You did this," he said. "You saved them." Lumi shook her head and placed her hand over his, her gaze filled with gratitude. "We did this," he corrected, his voice breaking with emotion. The days that followed were a blur of celebration and rebuilding. Lumi's people, who had been in hiding, emerged to welcome her return. Though they couldn't speak, their joy and gratitude were unmistakable. Dren found himself an unlikely hero among them. They treated him with kindness and respect, but what mattered most to him was the bond he shared with Lumi. One evening, as they stood together beneath the stars, Lumi reached for his hand. She gestured toward the sky, her expression wistful. "You want me to stay here," Dren guessed, "but you're worried I'll want to go back to Earth." She hesitated, then nodded. Dren smiled, pulling her into a gentle embrace. "Lumi, wherever you are, that's where I belong." Her eyes filled with tears, and she rested her forehead against his, their connection as strong as ever. As the stars above shimmered in the vast expanse of the universe, Dren knew he had found something he never thought possible. A love that crossed worlds, a purpose that transcended boundaries, and a home that wasn't tied to a place, but to a person. And in Lumi's arms, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be.